Hi, my name is Brittany Evans, and this is my final project called Where Am I Going? Developing Clear Learning Targets. Before I head out on my trail runs, I ask myself, where am I going? Where do I want to end? And am I prepared for the trek that lies before me? In the beginning of the semester, we were asked to examine the 7 strategies and determine how we implemented them in our classroom and where we wanted to improve. My desire was to improve on the areas of Strategy 1 and Strategy 2 to clarify the learning targets during my writer's workshop. As this was a personal area of focus for me, I wanted to zoom in on my rubric practices. Just as I need proper equipment for my trail runs, my students can use rubrics as a tool to understand the learning targets and guide their writing. Rubrics create a visual map of expectations I desire for my students to follow. But as I examined Strategy 2, I realized the rubric tool was a tool for me, not my students. I wanted them to be able to use it. I decided I need to change my practices in order to make my rubrics for my students. They would not only know the expectations, but also be able to use the rubrics to self-assess, monitor, and set goals for their own writing practices. I began using the 4 lesson plans in our textbook for introducing criteria to my first graders. These lessons provided the background my students needed to understand the purpose of criteria. The lessons connected with my students' knowledge of making decisions at home, like selecting a good fit family pet, or selecting the restaurant based on the time of day, or even getting dressed based on the weather. These are all items that I didn't ever realize or incorporate before, but it made criteria make sense for my students. Once my students had an understanding of the purpose of criteria, we were able to examine the specific rubric for our personal narratives. The students examined strong and weak examples from anonymous past students and were able to practice assessing the narratives using the rubrics. As I am running, it would be easy to miss the details around me, but I have found that I need to stop and see the beauty around me. I feel rested and ready to go once I begin again. It may be easy to rush through and say, here's the rubric and here are the expectations. But by slowing down and explicitly teaching criteria and going over the rubrics one aspect at a time, my students began adding details to strengthen their writing that my students in the past had missed. At times, the trail is not marked well, and it's easy to lose your way. In order to make sure my students stayed on track, I used mini lessons paired with mentor texts and regular student-teacher conferences to make sure they were where they needed to be. This allowed students to practice writing in a safe environment where their mistakes could be made, but where assistance and guidance was readily available to support them. Students continued to use the rubric guidelines as they selected a practice piece to publish. Using an editing checklist and a rubric, the students were able to self-assess their work, highlighting the quality they felt their work was in yellow. By having the students self-assess, I was able to get insight on their thoughts. I also was able to add my thoughts in blue, creating a green box when we agreed on the level of quality. Conferences were more meaningful as we could discuss the areas we disagreed and provide support for our own reasoning. From this, together we created stars, or areas of success, the students had demonstrated. I was careful to use statements to highlight progress based on the intended learning versus praise statements directed at the students, which I had often previously used. While highlighting success makes students feel accomplished, we also need to highlight areas needing growth or improvement. For this, we created stairs, or areas of next steps. Based on these next steps, we wrote and posted writing goals. Clearly posting the goals reminded students that even during independent writing, there are areas that they needed to work on to become better writers. We can develop rubrics, objectives, and goals, but if the students do not know what they are or how to use them, or even where to begin, they are not effective. They are not making a difference. Students need time to act. They need meaningful practice. They need to see the rubric more than once. They need to be able to go back and re-examine their work. Because if you do not go back, fix, and reflect, you might miss the beautiful change and growth that might have occurred otherwise. Be intentional with your practices. Running on the same trail may have slight changes day to day, but when you go back and reflect on the changes over time, they become more clear.